How's it going, my fellow snail sufferers? It's your missile guy. In my R-74 video, I hinted at a potential video on the Mig-1.44, in which I received a lot of comments asking about it. I then decided that there is a chance I could potentially turn proto-jets into a series on the channel. Like my obscure missile series where I discuss obscure missiles, in this series we will discuss canceled aircrafts that could come to War Thunder if Gaijin ever allowed it. Now, let's get on to my usual disclaimer. As you can hear, I am human, I am capable of making mistakes. If you catch any glaring mistakes, feel free to comment it below. While I do strive to keep all my information as accurate as possible at all times on my channel, sometimes mistakes can slip through and happen. If you notice any, feel free to mention it below in the comments. This helps my viewers see the mistake and correct information, and also helps me learn to improve overall accuracy in the future. With that out of the way, let's get on with the video. The origins of the Mig-144 stems back to a Soviet response to the U.S. Advanced Tactical Fighter effort, which later became the F-22 Raptor. In 1983, the Soviets would formally approve the I-90 requirement, which literally means fighter of the 1990s. Mikoyan would be tasked with a heavy multi-role design called MFI. Don't ask me to try to pronounce that. While a separate fighter known as the LFI was also on the table before being shelved to free up funding for the MFI program. Wind tunnel experiments would push Mikoyan towards a closed coupled canard delta wing layout for agility and lift. Since the airframe would be built to be intentionally unstable, a trend a lot of fighters started heading towards post F-16. By 1987, the MFI and LFI proposals went up for review, and in 1988, Mikoyan got the formal operation requirement for what was now called the Is The Mig-1.44. Now, before we go further, there's a naming mix-up that is worth clearing up right away, because you'll see both names thrown around online. 1.42 refers to the intended production fighter, while 1.44 is the designation given to the flying technology demonstrator. Basically a testbed to prove the aerodynamics and flight control software, not a combat-ready jet in its own right. Keep that distinction in your head because it actually matters later when we get to the stealth claims. Getting from a paper requirement to an actual flying jet took Mikoyan the better part of a decade, and along the way, the design settled into something unusual for a Soviet fighter. As mentioned before, the airframe used a closed coupled canard, wings swept at a 52 degrees, canard swept even harder at 58 degrees with a dogtooth leading edge to keep airflow clean at high angles of attack. Some sources claim the thing was controllable up to 60 degrees AOA, which if true is actually nuts for an aircraft of this size. The power came from the AL-41F afterburner turbofans, each pushing around 177 kilonewtons of thrust with each afterburner. And these weren't just brute force engines either, they had 2D thrust vectoring in both pitch and yaw, which combined with the canards what was supposed to give this thing its maneuverability. On paper, and I do mean on paper of course, because none of this actually got flight verified, the MFI was rated for a top speed of Mach 2.35 and a supercruise at Mach 1.5 without afterburner, with a total range of around 4,000 kilometers and a service ceiling of 17,000 meters. The radar would be an N014 pulse Doppler PESA, with a claimed detection range up to 420 kilometers, able to track 40 targets and engage 20 of them simultaneously. Weapons-wise, it was built around the same Vempel family a lot of you already know from in-game: R-77s, R-73s, and R-37s, as well as an Eternal GSH-30-1 30mm cannon with up to 250 rounds. However, and this is an important caveat for this whole segment, since the 1.44 barely flew, essentially none of these numbers were ever actually confirmed in the air. Everything is extrapolated from wind tunnel data, ground testing, and Soviet-era paperwork, so treat these specs the same way you treat a manufacturer's claimed muzzle velocity before independent testing. This is probably in the ballpark, but don't take it as factual for sure information. For War Thunder, if this aircraft was ever modeled, Gaijin would be doing what they already do with a lot of paper and prototype vehicles, taking incomplete real-world data and filling in the gaps with educated estimates. So don't expect a 144 in-game to play exactly like the spec sheet says, because nobody actually knows for certain what the spec sheet should say. Construction on the demonstrator was already underway when the Soviet Union would collapse in 1991, and that pulled the rug out from under the funding almost overnight. The aircraft sat half unfinished for years while Mikoyan scrapped by on whatever budget it could find. Mikoyan actually tried multiple times to get the government clearance just to allow them to show the jet publicly. In June 1995, the company's deputy general designer announced it might appear at the Max Air Show. The government would say no though. They tried again in 1997, also no. The project's existence wasn't even officially confirmed to the public until December of 1998, when a Russian newspaper ran a short piece with photos. The aircraft was finally rolled out on January 12, 1999 in front of the top Russian military brass and international press, which is wild when you think about it. This jet had been under construction in some form since the late 80s, and the public didn't get a proper look at it until 1999. So in terms of numbers for its performance, I need to be upfront right away. This segment may be the messiest sourcing of the entire video, so bear with me. The figures you'll see repeated most often across aviation sites put the 144 at around 19 meters long with a wingspan around 15 meters, an empty weight around 18,000 kilograms, and a max takeoff weight somewhere around 35,000 kilograms. Top speed gets quoted at Mach 2.35 with super cruise, meaning a sustained supersonic flight without afterburner, at around Mach 1.5. Range is usually listed around 4,000 kilometers with a service ceiling around 17,000 meters. And this is kind of where it falls apart. If you actually go source hunting yourself, basically every one of those numbers has a competing figure somewhere else. Some sites will say the max takeoff weight is 37,000 kilograms instead of 35. Top speed will show up as Mach 2.5 on at least one aviation history site instead of 2.35. Service ceilings get quoted anywhere from 17,000 meters to 19,000 or even 20,000, which is stuff I've seen. Some sources have it a couple meters longer and with a noticeably lighter wingspan than others. I even found one source giving the 1.42 spec numbers, lower weight, differing ceiling, and presenting them as if they were 144 numbers, which might in itself explain a chunk of disagreement across the internet. People conflating the two like we've talked about in segment 1. For the engines, that part is a little more consistent. The two Saturn AL41F afterburning turbofans, dry thrust listed at around 117 kilonewtons each, with afterburning thrust at around 177 kilonewtons each, which is a really massive amount of combined thrust for an airframe of that size. The thruster-weight ratio is estimated to be over 1 up to 1.15 with afterburner lit, meaning depending which estimate you believe, this thing may or may not have been able to accelerate straight up while holding airspeed, which is the general benchmark for a greater than 1-to-1 thruster-weight fighter. However, I want to stress the same point from segment 2 here again. It matters even more for a performance segment specifically. This jet flew exactly twice for a combined 40 minutes, topping out at 600 kilometers an hour and 1,000 meters altitude on the flights we actually have records of. Every Mach 2.35, every Super Cruise claim, every one of these numbers is a design target or a wind tunnel estimate, not something a test pilot has ever actually confirmed by pushing the jet to its limits. So when you see different numbers on different websites, it's that nobody, including McCoyan itself, ever got the chance to nail these figures down for real. For War Thunder, this was honestly the biggest headache the 144 would present if Gaijin ever seriously considered it as an event vehicle or something. Because unlike jets with actual combat records or full test campaigns to pull real flight data from, they'd be choosing between a handful of conflicting Soviet-era design targets and just picking one. I wouldn't be surprised if, hypothetically, the in-game version ends up performing nothing like whatever numbers you may see online, because honestly, again, nobody can tell you with real confidence which number is even right. So, on about its plasma stealth, and this one is fun because it comes up constantly whenever the 144 gets discussed online. It is rumored that the MiG-144 had a working plasma stealth, some kind of ionized gas shield around the airframe that made it borderline invisible to radar, with RCS figures as low as 0.001 square meters getting thrown around. Why people believe this? Honestly, because it sounds awesome, and because it wasn't pulled entirely out of thin air either. Soviet researchers actually did study plasma stealth concepts going back decades, and there's at least one claim that the tech was originally intended for a cruise missile program before anyone tied it down to the 144. So there's a real research thread here. It's not pure fabrication out of thin air. However, the reality is a lot less exciting. There's no credible evidence plasma stealth was ever actually installed or functionally demonstrated by the 144 prototype. The actual planned stealth approach for the aircraft was the boring conventional stuff: radar absorbent coatings, internal weapon bays on the production 142 version, shaping the engine ducts to hide the compressor faces. Aviation historians have pointed out that generating a plasma field strong enough to matter takes a huge amount of power, and it creates its own problems like blacking out your own radar and radio. The fact that literally every Russian stealth design since, including the Su-57, went back to a conventional angular shaping instead of chasing plasma stealth is a pretty strong hint that it never got made to work practically. And remember that naming distinction from segment 1? The 144 demonstrator didn't even have an internal weapons bay. The production 142 was supposed to get. So even the boring real stealth measures were incomplete on the jet that actually flew. Whatever the true RCS may be, it almost certainly wasn't anywhere close to the .001 number that gets repeated everywhere. Alright, stepping back from the real world specifics, here's why I think the 144 is actually a fascinating what if for War Thunder specifically. Right now, Russia doesn't even have a proper stealth fighter in the game. Obviously, we haven't touched 5th gen. The highest tier jet we currently have access to is the Su-30 SM-2. The real question isn't really how it would perform, it's would Gaijin even add it in the first place? And this is where I think the honest answer is probably not anytime soon. But it's not zero either, because the 144 actually flew twice. Even though it was slow and brief, they still happened, and it technically clears the bar Gaijin has used before to justify adding real prototypes as event vehicles. Unlike a lot of pure paper projects that never left the drawing board, Gaijin has showed pretty clearly they're not exactly eager to add tech demonstrators specifically, and the proof of that is sitting right in front of us with the Su-47 we talked about earlier. A jet that flew constantly for years, completed actual test programs, and even passed a community suggestion process, and it's still not in the game. If a demonstrator with that much of a track record is still waiting, a jet that flew twice for 40 minutes and is 5th gen technically is probably going to wait even longer. So realistically, don't hold your breath, but as far as what could have been prototypes go, if Gaijin ever does start opening the door to Soviet stealth demonstrators as event vehicles, the 144 is at least a real blown candidate rather than a fantasy, which is more than you can say for a lot of what gets requested in the suggestion forums, to be honest. For War Thunder, this is honestly the one part of the whole 144 package where Gaijin wouldn't be starting completely from zero. The R-77 and R-73 are already flying around in game on other Russian jets, so at least part of the ammo belt is ready. It's the R-37 along with its flight model, the radar, and the actual real-world performance. That is where they would have to build from nothing. Anyways, that's all I have for you, my fellow snail sufferers. If you found this one interesting, consider leaving a like, hyping the video, or if you wish to support the channel even further, hit that sub button. It's the best free way to support my channel as we slowly grow towards 5,000 subs. Well, there you have it, my fellow snail sufferers. This is your missile guy, and I hope to see you in the next one.